The morning Jake Morrison decided to change his life started like any other. He woke before dawn, fed his horses, checked the cattle, and went through all the familiar motions that had defined his existence for 15 years. But as he approached the fence line between his ranch and Martha Sullivan's property, he carried something with him that he'd never brought to these morning routines, a decision that would alter everything about who he thought he was. Emma was waiting for him, just as he'd somehow known she would be. She sat on the top rail of the fence, her legs swinging freely, Ranger the stuffed horse balanced carefully beside her. She wore a purple sweater that was clearly handmade, probably by her grandmother, and her hair was pulled back in a single ponytail instead of the usual braids. Something about her posture suggested she understood the significance of this meeting. "Good morning, Jake," she said as he approached on Thunder. The use of his first name felt natural, as if they'd already crossed some invisible boundary that made formal address unnecessary. "Morning, Emma." Jake dismounted and approached the fence, nervous in a way he couldn't remember feeling since he was much younger. "I've been thinking about what you asked me." Emma nodded seriously. "I figured you had. Grandma says important thoughts take time to settle into place." Jake found himself once again amazed by the wisdom that seemed to flow so naturally from this 8-year-old. "Your grandmother and I had a long talk yesterday. She told me. She said you asked good questions, the kind that showed you were really thinking about everything instead of just looking for reasons to say no." The insight behind that observation made Jake realize that Emma had been more anxious about his answer than her calm demeanor had suggested. She'd been studying his behavior, looking for clues about his intentions, hoping for signs that he was approaching her request with the seriousness it deserved. "I want to ask you some questions too," Jake said, "before I give you my answer." Emma straightened up, her expression becoming even more focused. "Okay, why me, Emma? Really, there have to be other options, other people who would be better suited to take care of you." Emma was quiet for a long moment, and Jake could see her thinking through how to explain something that perhaps had never needed explanation in her own mind. "Do you remember the day Thunder got spooked by that snake last month?" she asked finally. Jake nodded. Thunder was usually the calmest horse on the ranch, but a rattlesnake had startled him one morning, and Jake had spent nearly an hour talking him through his fear, never losing patience even when the horse refused to calm down. "I was watching from my bedroom window," Emma continued. "Most people would have gotten frustrated or given up, but you just kept talking to him, kept your voice steady and calm until he felt safe again. You didn't try to force him to get over it faster, and you didn't make him feel bad for being scared." She paused, swinging her legs more slowly. "I've been scared a lot lately, thinking about what might happen to me, and I thought about how Thunder probably felt that day, and how you helped him feel better just by staying with him and not giving up. I want someone like that, someone who won't give up on me even if I get scared or difficult." The parallels Emma had drawn between herself and a frightened horse might have seemed simplistic, but Jake understood the deeper truth she was expressing. She wasn't just asking for someone to provide food and shelter. She was asking for someone who would have patience with her emotions, who would stay calm in the face of her fears, who would help her feel safe without demanding that she pretend to be braver than she was. "What if I don't know how to help you with things?" Jake asked. "What if you need something I can't give you?" Emma smiled then, and Jake saw an echo of her grandmother's gentle confidence. "Then, we'll figure it out together. Grandma says the best relationships are the ones where people help each other learn new things." The simplicity of that response was both reassuring and challenging. Emma wasn't expecting him to be perfect or to have all the answers. She was proposing a partnership where they would both grow and change, where his inexperience with children would be balanced by her willingness to be patient while he learned. "Are you sure this is what you want?" Jake asked. "Living with someone you barely know, leaving everything familiar behind?" Emma looked around at the landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions, at the mountains that rose in the distance, and the big sky that dominated everything beneath it. "This place isn't going to be unfamiliar," she said. "This is home. The house might be different, and the daily routine might change, but the important stuff will still be here." Jake followed her gaze, seeing the familiar terrain through her eyes for perhaps the first time. She was right. The essence of this place, the things that made it special, weren't dependent on which specific building she slept in or which adult was responsible for her care. The vastness, the quiet beauty, the sense of being connected to something larger than oneself, all of that would remain constant. Besides, Emma added, I know more about you than you think. I know you're kind to animals and honest in your work and that you keep your promises. I know you don't waste things and you don't compel 3 days after Emma's initial request. Jake found himself doing something he hadn't done in over a decade, seeking advice from another person. He sat across from Martha Sullivan in her modest kitchen, a cup of coffee growing cold between his hands as he struggled to find the words for what he needed to say. Martha was a small woman with silver hair that she kept pinned back in a neat bun, and eyes that seemed to hold decades of accumulated wisdom. Despite the obvious signs of her illness, the way she moved more slowly than she used to, the medication bottles lined up on her kitchen counter, the slight tremor in her hands, she still possessed the kind of quiet strength that made it easy to understand where Emma got her remarkable composure. She asked you, didn't she? Martha said gently, saving Jake from having to explain why he'd suddenly shown up at her door asking to talk. Jake nodded, surprised that Martha had already figured out the purpose of his visit. Yesterday morning. Caught me completely off guard. Martha smiled, and Jake could see echoes of Emma's directness in her expression. That's my granddaughter. She doesn't believe in beating around the bush when something's important. Mrs. Sullivan, I have to be honest with you. I don't know the first thing about taking care of a child. I've been on my own for most of my adult life, and I've never even been around kids much, let alone been responsible for one. Martha studied his face with the same intensity that Emma had shown, as if she were looking for something specific in his features. Can I ask you something, Jake? Why did you come here today instead of just telling Emma no? The question made Jake pause. He'd been asking himself the same thing since he'd knocked on Martha's door 20 minutes earlier. The easy answer would have been to simply tell Emma that her request was impossible and suggest she speak with a social worker or family services about proper placement options. But, instead, he'd found himself wanting to understand more about the situation, to explore possibilities he'd never considered before. I guess I wanted to understand what I'd be getting into, he said finally. That's not really an answer, Martha replied with a gentle smile. That's what you're telling yourself. What's the real reason? Jake felt his defenses rising. He wasn't used to being challenged this way, wasn't comfortable with people who insisted on digging deeper than surface explanations. But something about Martha's manner, patient, non-judgmental, genuinely curious, made it difficult to maintain his usual emotional walls. She said something that stuck with me, he admitted, about thinking I was the kind of person who wouldn't let bad things happen if I could stop them. I keep wondering if that's true. Martha nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense to her. Emma's always been good at seeing the best in people. Sometimes she sees things in folks that they don't even see in themselves. She stood up slowly and moved to the window that looked out over her property toward the Broken Arrow Ranch. You know, I've been watching you for years, Jake Morrison. Every time my fence gets damaged in a storm, you're out there the next morning fixing it without being asked. When my old dog Belle got sick last year, you drove her to the vet in town and never mentioned the bill that I know you paid. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He'd hoped those gestures had gone unnoticed, small acts of neighborly kindness that he'd performed without expecting recognition or gratitude. I also know you've been sending anonymous donations to the Children's Hospital in Billings every Christmas for the past 8 years, Martha continued. My friend Helen works in the billing department there. She mentioned it once, said they had this mysterious benefactor who never wanted credit for his generosity. Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. The donations had been his way of dealing with the guilt he felt around Christmas time, a private acknowledgement of children who were suffering while he lived his comfortable, solitary life. He'd never imagined anyone would trace them back to him. How did you? Small town, Martha said simply. People notice things, even when you don't want them to. The point is, you've been taking care of people for years without realizing it. You just haven't been taking care of anyone up close. She returned to her seat at the table and looked at Jake with an expression that was both sad and hopeful. Emma's been through a lot in her short life. Her parents died in a car accident when she was 4, and she came to live with me. She's had to grow up faster than any child should, had to learn to be brave in situations that would terrify most adults. Jake felt his chest tighten as he imagined Emma as an even smaller child, dealing with the kind of loss that would devastate people twice her age. It explains so much about her unusual maturity, her way of approaching difficult topics with such composure. She's not asking you to be her father, Martha continued. She understands that's not what this would be about. She's asking you to be her safe place, her constant, the person she can count on when everything else feels uncertain. But what if I'm not good at it? Jake asked, voicing the fear that had been keeping him awake at night. What if I let her down? Martha reached across the table and patted his hand with surprising warmth. You think I knew what I was doing when Emma first came to live with me? I'd raised one daughter, but that was 30 years ago, and Emma was dealing with trauma I'd never experienced. I made mistakes, lots of them, but you know what I learned? Love covers a multitude of errors. Caring enough to try your best is usually enough. Jake found himself thinking about his own childhood, about the series of foster homes and distant relatives who had taken him in after his own parents' deaths. He'd been older than Emma when tragedy struck, 12 instead of 4. But he remembered the feeling of being passed from one reluctant caregiver to another, always sensing that he was more obligation than blessing. I was in foster care myself, he said quietly. From 12 to 18. I swore I'd never put myself in the position of being responsible for someone else's child because I knew how easy it was to mess it up. Martha's expression softened with understanding. Maybe that's exactly why you'd be good at this. You know what it feels like to need someone to choose you, not because they have to, but because they want to. The truth of that observation hit Jake like a physical blow. Throughout his childhood, he dreamed of someone who would see him as more than a burden, who would choose to make him part of their life not out of duty or obligation, but out of genuine care. He'd given up on that dream as an adult, convinced that such connections were either impossible or not worth the risk they required. But Emma was offering him the chance to be that person for someone else. She was asking him to choose her, to make her part of his life not because anyone was forcing him to, but because he believed she was worth it. There's something else you should know, Martha said, interrupting his thoughts. Emma hasn't just been watching you work around the ranch. She's been studying you, learning about you. She knows you read books on your porch in the evenings. She knows you always check on the animals one more time before bed, even when you're tired. She knows you talk to your horses like they're old friends. Jake was amazed at the level of detail in Emma's observations. He'd had no idea that his daily routines were being so carefully monitored, that his small habits and preferences had been cataloged by someone who cared enough to pay attention. She told me once that she thinks you're lonely, Martha continued. Not sad lonely, but quietly lonely, like someone who's forgotten that they're supposed to have people in their life who matter to them. The accuracy of that assessment was unsettling. Jake had become so accustomed to his solitude that he'd stopped thinking of it as loneliness. He'd convinced himself that his independence was a choice, a preference for simplicity over the complications that came with close relationships. But Emma had seen through that facade to something he'd been hiding even from himself. If I said yes, Jake said slowly, what would that actually look like? I mean, practically speaking. Martha's face lit up with something that looked like relief mixed with hope. Well, first we need to talk to Emma's caseworker and make sure all the legal requirements are met. You need to go through background checks and training, but given your clean record and stable employment, I don't anticipate any problems there. She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. As for the day-to-day reality, Emma's pretty self-sufficient for her age. She can get herself dressed and fed in the morning. She does her homework without being nagged, and she's responsible about chores. She'd need transportation to and from school, help with homework when she gets stuck, someone to make sure she eats vegetables and gets to bed at a reasonable hour. Jake tried to imagine his quiet evening routine expanded to include another person, tried to picture himself helping with math homework and negotiating bedtime arguments. The idea was both appealing and terrifying. She'd also need someone to listen to her, Martha added. Emma processes things by talking them through. She'll want to tell you about her day, ask your opinion about things that are bothering her, share ideas that pop into her head. She needs to feel heard and valued, not just cared for. That prospect seemed less daunting to Jake. Despite his discomfort with emotional complexity, he'd always been a good listener. It was one of the few social skills he'd developed over the years, the ability to pay attention when someone needed to be heard. What about when you? Jake started, then stopped, unsure how to finish the question tactfully. When I die, Martha said matter-of-factly. Emma would continue living with you, assuming that's what you both want. Her aunt in California is willing to take her if needed, but she's already made it clear that she'd prefer Emma to stay here if there's a suitable guardian available. Martha stood up again and moved to a small desk in the corner of the kitchen, returning with a manila folder. I've been putting together some information for whoever ends up being Emma's guardian. Medical records, school information, family history, that sort of thing. But there's also some other stuff in here that might help you understand her better. She opened the folder and pulled out a small stack of drawings. Emma made these for you, she said, handing them to Jake. She's been working on them for the past few days. Jake looked down at the papers in his hands, surprised by the detail and care that had gone into each drawing. The first showed him sitting on Thunder, but instead of being alone, there was a small figure sitting behind him on the horse. The second depicted the ranch house with smoke coming from the chimney and two figures visible in one of the windows. The third was a drawing of a kitchen table with two place settings and a vase of wildflowers in the center. Each drawing told a story of belonging, of shared experiences, of a life that included both of them. Emma had imagined herself into his world so thoroughly that Jake could almost see how it might work, how his solitary existence could be transformed into something richer and more meaningful. She's been planning this for weeks, hasn't she? He asked. Martha nodded. Ever since the doctors gave me the latest prognosis. Emma's way of dealing with scary situations is to take action, to figure out solutions before problems become crises. She decided you were her best option and started working toward making it happen. Jake felt a mixture of admiration and responsibility settling over him like a heavy cloak. This 8-year-old girl had been more proactive about securing her future than most adults he knew. She'd identified what she needed, researched her options, and made her request with clarity and courage. How could he respond to that kind of determination with anything less than equal courage? I need to ask her some questions, Jake said finally. If I'm going to consider this seriously, I need to understand what she's really asking for, what her expectations are. Martha smiled, and for the first time since he'd arrived, she looked truly relaxed. I think that's a wonderful idea. Emma's been hoping you'd want to get to know her better before making your decision. As Jake prepared to leave Martha's house, she walked him to the door and placed a gentle hand on his arm. You know, Jake, I think Emma might be offering you something just as valuable as what you'd be offering her. What do you mean? A chance to discover that you're capable of more love than you ever thought possible. A chance to find out that the lonely cowboy act you've been performing for all these years isn't really who you are at heart. Jake drove back to his cabin that evening with Emma's drawings on the passenger seat beside him and Martha's words echoing in his mind. He'd come to the conversation hoping to gather information that would help him make a rational decision about Emma's request. Instead, he'd discovered that the decision was about much more than practical considerations or logical analysis. It was about whether he was brave enough to let someone need him, whether he was willing to risk the possibility of failure for the chance at something he'd never allowed himself to want. It was about choosing connection over safety, love over loneliness, hope over the comfortable predictability of isolation. For the first time in his adult life, Jake Morrison was seriously considering saying yes to a future he'd never imagined possible. And, despite his fears, despite his doubts about his own capabilities, he found himself looking forward to the conversation he would have with Emma the next morning. Jake Morrison had been working the same ranch for 15 years, and, in all that time, he'd never had a conversation that lasted more than 10 minutes with anyone under the age of 16. Children made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't explain, like they could see right through the tough exterior he'd spent decades building. So when 8-year-old Emma Sullivan appeared at the fence line of the Broken Arrow Ranch on a Tuesday morning in late September, clutching a worn stuffed horse and looking up at him with eyes the color of prairie grass, Jake's first instinct was to tip his hat, and right away. But something about the way she stood there, so small against the endless Montana sky, made him pause. Her blonde hair was pulled back in two uneven braids, and her jeans were rolled up at the cuffs, clearly hand-me-downs from someone much taller. She wore a faded pink t-shirt with a unicorn on it, and her sneakers were scuffed from countless adventures across the dusty ground of her grandmother's property next door. "Mister," she called out, her voice carrying across the morning air with the kind of clarity that only children possess. "Are you a real cowboy?" Jake pulled his horse, Thunder, to a complete stop. The question caught him off guard, not because it was unusual. Tourists asked him that all the time, but because of the way she asked it. There was no awe in her voice, no excitement, just curiosity, as if she were asking whether he preferred coffee or tea. "I suppose I am," he replied, adjusting his worn cowboy hat. "Been working cattle most of my life." Emma nodded seriously, as if this information required careful consideration. She walked closer to the fence, her stuffed horse bouncing against her side with each step. "My grandma says you've been here longer than anybody. She says you know all the horses' names and can tell when it's going to rain just by looking at the sky." Jake couldn't help but smile slightly at that. Martha Sullivan, Emma's grandmother, had lived on the neighboring property for nearly as long as he'd been working the ranch. She was a widow who kept to herself mostly, but she always waved when she saw him checking the fence line that bordered their properties. "Your grandma talks too much," Jake said, though there was no harshness in his voice. "She talks just the right amount." Emma corrected him with the confidence of someone who had never doubted herself. "She told me lots of things about you. She says you help fix her fence when the storms knock it down, and you don't even ask for anything back." Jake shifted in his saddle, uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. He wasn't used to being noticed for the small kindnesses he performed, and he certainly wasn't used to discussing them with children. Neighbors help neighbors. That's just how things work out here. Emma studied his face for a long moment, and Jake had the unsettling feeling that she was somehow taking his measure. Children had a way of looking at adults that made even the most confident person feel like they were being examined under a microscope. "I have a question for you," she said finally. "But it's kind of a big one." Jake glanced toward the ranch house in the distance, where he knew the other hands would be wondering where he'd gotten to. He had a full day of work ahead of him, and standing here talking to a neighbor's granddaughter wasn't on his list of priorities. But something in Emma's tone made him hesitate. "What kind of question?" he asked. Emma looked down at her stuffed horse, running her fingers through its tangled mane. "The kind that might make you uncomfortable. Grandma says adults don't like uncomfortable questions." Despite himself, Jake found his curiosity piqued. He'd been asked plenty of uncomfortable questions in his life, mostly by women who wanted to know why a man his age wasn't married, or by well-meaning relatives who wondered when he was going to settle down and start a family. But he'd never had a child warn him ahead of time that a question might make him squirm. "Try me," he said. Emma took a deep breath, the way people do when they're about to jump into cold water. "My grandma is getting really sick. The doctors say she might not get better, and I might have to go live with my aunt in California if something happens to her." Jake felt his chest tighten. He'd noticed that Martha seemed frilier lately, but he'd assumed it was just the normal wear and tear of getting older. The thought of her being seriously ill, of this little girl losing the only family she seemed to have nearby, made something twist uncomfortably in his stomach. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said quietly. Emma nodded, accepting his sympathy with the same seriousness she'd shown throughout their conversation. "The thing is, I don't want to go to California. I like it here. I like the wide spaces and the way the mountains look in the morning, and I like knowing that there are cowboys like you taking care of things." Jake didn't know what to say to that. He'd never thought of himself as someone who took care of anything beyond cattle and horses. The idea that a child might find comfort in his presence was foreign and slightly overwhelming. "But here's my big question," Emma continued. "If something happens to Grandma, and if my aunt can't take care of me right away, would you consider letting me stay here, just until things get figured out?" The question hit Jake like a physical blow. He stared down at this small girl who was asking him, essentially, to become responsible for another human being. The very idea terrified him in ways he couldn't begin to articulate. "Emma," he started, but she held up her hand. "I know it sounds crazy," she said quickly. "I know you don't know me very well, and I know taking care of a kid isn't something cowboys usually do. But I've been watching you, and I think you're the kind of person who wouldn't let bad things happen if you could stop them. Jake felt like the ground was shifting beneath him. This conversation had gone from a simple greeting to a life-changing request in the span of minutes. And he had no idea how to respond. The responsible thing would be to tell Emma that she needed to talk to her grandmother about making proper arrangements, that he wasn't equipped to take care of a child, that there were professionals who handled these kinds of situations. But, as he looked down at her hopeful face, he found himself thinking about all the times he'd seen her playing alone in her grandmother's yard, creating elaborate games with nothing but sticks and imagination. He thought about the way she'd asked if he was a real cowboy, as if the answer mattered more than he could understand. "Why me?" he asked finally. "You don't even know me." Emma smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her all morning. "Grandma says you can tell a lot about a person by watching how they treat animals. She says you're gentle with the horses even when they're being difficult, and you always make sure the cattle have enough water, even when it means extra work for you." Jake realized that Martha Sullivan had been observing him far more closely than he'd ever imagined. The idea that his daily routines, the small acts of care he performed without thinking, had been noticed and interpreted as evidence of his character was both humbling and slightly embarrassing. "Taking care of animals isn't the same as taking care of a person," he said. "I know that," Emma replied. "But it's a start, isn't it?" The simplicity of her logic was both maddening and undeniable. Jake had spent his adult life avoiding exactly this kind of responsibility, this level of emotional investment in another person's well-being. He'd convinced himself that he was better off alone, that caring for people led to disappointment and heartbreak, and complications he was better off without. But, as he sat there on Thunder, looking down at this brave little girl who was facing the possibility of losing everything she knew and loved, he felt something crack open inside him. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, a sense that maybe his carefully constructed solitude wasn't as fulfilling as he'd convinced himself it was. "I need to think about this," he said finally. Emma nodded, as if she'd expected nothing less. "That's okay. Grandma says important decisions shouldn't be rushed." She turned to go, then paused and looked back at him. "Would you like to meet my horse?" she asked, holding up the stuffed animal. "His name is Ranger, and he's been my best friend since I was 5. Jake found himself nodding before he'd consciously decided to respond. Emma climbed up on the bottom rail of the fence and held Ranger out toward him. Jake reached down and solemnly shook the stuffed horse's hoof, noting the way Emma's face lit up at this gesture of acknowledgement. "Ranger says thank you for considering my request," she said with perfect seriousness. "He also says that if you decide you can't help, he understands. But he hopes you'll at least think about it really hard." With that, Emma climbed down from the fence and walked back toward her grandmother's house, her braids bouncing, and Ranger tucked securely under her arm. Jake watched her go, noting the confident set of her small shoulders and the way she seemed to belong to this landscape as naturally as the native grasses that grew wild along the fence line. As he rode back toward the ranch house, Jake found himself thinking about the conversation in ways he hadn't expected. Emma's request had awakened something in him that he'd thought was long dead, a sense of purpose that went beyond his daily routines, a feeling that maybe his life could mean something more than just the successful completion of assigned tasks. But with that awakening came fear. Jake had built his life around predictability and emotional safety. He knew exactly what each day would bring, exactly what was expected of him, exactly how to navigate his world without risking the kind of pain that came from caring too much about things beyond his control. Taking responsibility for Emma would change everything. It would mean opening himself up to the possibility of failure, of not being good enough, of letting down someone who was depending on him. It would mean facing parts of himself he'd spent years avoiding, confronting the reasons why he'd chosen isolation over connection. That evening, as Jake sat on the porch of his small cabin nursing a cup of coffee and watching the sun set behind the mountains, he found himself replaying every moment of his conversation with Emma. Her words echoed in his mind. "I think you're the kind of person who wouldn't let bad things happen if you could stop them." Was that true? Was that who he really was, underneath all the layers of self-protection he'd built up over the years? Jake had never thought of himself as particularly heroic or noble. He was just a man who did his job and tried to stay out of trouble. But maybe Emma saw something in him that he'd forgotten was there. The next morning brought rain, just as Jake had predicted it would. He could smell it in the air before the first clouds appeared on the horizon, could feel it in the restless way the cattle moved in the pasture. As he went about his morning chores, checking on the horses and making sure all the gates were secure, he found himself glancing repeatedly toward Martha Sullivan's property. He could see lights on in the house, could imagine Emma and her grandmother going about their morning routines. The normalcy of it all made Emma's request seem even more surreal. How could such an ordinary morning contain the possibility of such a life-changing decision? When he finished his morning rounds, Jake made a decision that surprised him. Instead of heading back to the ranch house for breakfast with the other hands, he saddled Thunder and rode to the fence line between the properties. He told himself he was just checking for storm damage, but deep down he knew he was hoping to see Emma again. She appeared almost as if she'd been waiting for him, emerging from the house in a bright yellow raincoat that made her look like a small beacon of sunshine against the gray morning sky. She ran to the fence, her boots splashing through puddles with the carefree enthusiasm of childhood. "You came back," she called out, and Jake could hear the delight in her voice. "Just checking the fence after the storm," he replied, but they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Emma climbed up on the fence rail again, balancing there with the fearless confidence of someone who had never learned to be afraid of falling. "Did you think about my question?" Jake had thought about little else, but he found himself reluctant to admit that. "Some," he said. "What did you decide?" The directness of her question caught him off guard again. Adults, in his experience, approached difficult topics obliquely, dancing around the real issues with polite conversation and careful phrasing. But Emma had no patience for such subtleties. She wanted to know, and she asked. "I haven't decided anything yet," Jake said honestly. "It's a big responsibility you're asking about." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "Grandma says the biggest responsibilities are usually the most important ones." There was wisdom in that observation that made Jake wonder what kind of conversations Emma had with her grandmother. Most 8-year-olds he'd encountered seemed primarily concerned with toys and games and immediate pleasures. But Emma spoke like someone who had been forced to think about serious things, someone who understood that life could be uncertain and painful. "Can I ask you something?" Jake said. "Sure. Why aren't you scared?" "About your grandmother being sick, about maybe having to leave." Most kids would be terrified. Emma was quiet for a long moment, and Jake could see her considering how to answer. When she spoke, her voice was softer than usual, more vulnerable. "I am scared," she admitted. "I'm scared every day. But Grandma told me that being scared doesn't mean you stop trying to find solutions. It just means you have to be braver than the scared feeling." Jake felt something shift in his chest at those words. Here was this little girl, facing the possibility of losing everything that mattered to her. And instead of giving in to fear, she was actively seeking ways to take control of her situation. She had identified what she needed and asked for it directly, without apology or manipulation. There was a strength in that approach that Jake found both admirable and humbling. "Your grandmother sounds like a smart woman," he said. "She is," Emma agreed. "She taught me that most people are good if you give them a chance to be good. She says sometimes people just need someone to believe in them." The implication hung in the air between them. Emma wasn't just asking Jake to take care of her. She was telling him that she believed he was capable of being the kind of person who could take care of her. She was offering him a chance to be better than he thought he was, to step into a version of himself that he'd never imagined possible. As Jake rode back to the ranch house that morning, he found himself thinking about belief and the power it could have to transform people. Emma believed he could be trusted with her safety, her future, her well-being. The weight of that belief was both terrifying and oddly exhilarating. For the first time in years, Jake Morrison began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he was capable of more than he'd given himself credit for. And for the first time since Emma had asked her question, he began to consider the possibility that his answer might be yes.